Welcome and happy International Day of Peace. The Day of Peace was created by the United Nations back in 1981, and it was established as a way for people around the world to have a day to celebrate and commit to building a culture of peace around the world. So the Center for Conflict Resolution here at BYU Law School, one way that we want to contribute to that effort, one way that we came up with to contribute to that effort is to have our annual Peacemaker Award and lecture. And through that, we hope to recognize someone who has done a lot to contribute to peace in the community around the world, and hear from their experience and learn from them. One peace advocate and mentor of mine was Eugene England. He taught English here at BYU for a long time. And in an essay where he was talking about and encouraging us to have more godlike love toward others, he wrote the following: Jesus not only began his ministry with a focus on the poor, he ended it with the same focus. In his last sermon to his disciples, he said he would come to judge the world, to divide the sheep from the goats. And he told them clearly what the criterion of judgment would be. Do you remember what it was? Not whether we've been to the temple or paid our tithing, not even whether we're Mormon or have confessed Christ as our Lord. Surprisingly, and an offense and stumbling block to many of us, he tells his disciples that his only criterion by which he will separate the good from the evil, the saved from the damned, will be whether we have actually done to the least of his brethren what we think we would do for him. I was an hungered, and ye gave me meat. I was a stranger, and ye took me in prison, and ye came unto me. The peacemaker we're honoring today is someone who I think exemplifies this call and has made her life's work a focus on peace and understanding, especially among the world's poorest and vulnerable populations. Catherine Marshall is a senior fellow at Georgetown's Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs, where she leads the center's work on religion and global development. She's a professor of the practice of development, conflict, and religion in Georgetown's Walsh School of Foreign Service. She helped create and now serves as the executive director of the World Faiths Development Dialogue. She worked for a long time at the World Bank from 1971 to 2006 and has nearly 4 decades of experience on a wide range of development issues in Africa, Latin America, East Asia, and the Middle East, particularly those facing the world's poorest countries. She led the World Bank's Faith and Ethics Initiative between 2000 and 2006. Professor Marshall's authored a number of books, including most recently a book she co-edited titled Women, Religion, and Peacebuilding, Illuminating the Unseen. She has a bachelor's degree from Wellesley College, a master's degree from Princeton, and an MPA from Princeton's Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs, and she also has an honorary doctorate from the University of Cambodia. We give our Peacemaker Award in the form of a bonsai tree. And bonsai trees are really beautiful, but they don't just happen, right? They take a lot of work and care and patience, and we feel like that's a really fitting metaphor for peace building. So please join me in welcoming our 2018 Peacemaker of the Year, Catherine Marshall.
Well, good afternoon, and thank you all for coming. It's a tremendous honor. I have various associations with Brigham Young University and with intensive current ones with the law school. So it's a pleasure to be back in Provo and to have this opportunity to reflect with you on this International Day of Peace. So as I was trying to see which of the many threads I would discuss, I essentially thought I'd start with what is peace building? Why is this a term that's being used, and as someone in an email this morning pointed out, that if you use peace building as one word, you will get a spelling correction coming to it. I wanted to explore some of the powerful but complex ways in which development, conflict, peace, justice, and prosperity are linked, and bring in the also very complex religious dimensions. I also wanted to reflect on some of the ways in which I feel I have learned, mistakes I've made, mistakes that many in the field have made, successes perhaps, and hopes and opportunities as we look to the future. Since many of your colleagues are deeply involved in a meeting that's taking place next week in Buenos Aires, the G20 Interfaith Forum, I thought I'd reflect a little bit on how that meeting is linked to the work that you're doing here. And then looking ahead, thinking about the dynamics of change today and how it differs from the past. And if I talk too much and get carried away with stories, I will just stop so that we have time for questions when it comes to 1:40. So Albert Einstein had a wonderful quotation: "Peace cannot be kept by force. It can only be achieved by understanding." And I think that puts the onus onto the reflection that we're having today, and on your focus on this question of the importance of peace building in the broader context. And I'm going to start with, first of all, one caution about conflict and peace, and one story, the donkey story. So the caution is what I call the Tolstoy warning, which is his comment that, which is not entirely true, but still, that all happy families are happy in similar ways, but all unhappy families are different and are unhappy in very different ways. And that certainly seems to be true of conflicts. And the word that keeps coming up in work that I'm doing now around conflict is context. Context, context, context. That if you do not understand the context, you cannot work on achieving any peace. So the donkey story. I was working on an African country, which I will not name, and was visiting at a very difficult time when issues of human rights and corruption were very central to the agenda of the World Bank at the time and the government. I was about to chair what's called a consultative group, which is all of the external donor agencies were meeting basically to review the country's program. And it was a very difficult time because of the extrajudicial killings that were happening. It was actually a country, one of the very last countries where slavery was still legal and widely practiced. So I was going to visit an area where these problems were very acute with the Minister of Agriculture, who I assure you did not want to be in a car with this American woman for several hours as we traveled along. So he had been a military person, recently appointed Minister of Agriculture. So I started asking him about agriculture. So we started with camels, where he knew every camel by name. We then went on to cattle and sheep and so forth. And he knew less, was less interested, but clearly we had something to talk about. Chickens, goats, not much interest. But we finally came to a very poor village. And I looked around and I saw, as you do in many African villages, many, many donkeys, children riding them, carrying roofing for the houses, water, etc. And so I said, well, what about donkeys? So he said, we don't have any donkeys. And I said, well, what are these things that I see? And he said, that's unimportant. And I think that that's a metaphor, in a sense, for the siloed worlds that we live in, that people really, first of all, they simply do not see many aspects of a problem or of a situation that don't fit into their worldview. And even if they see it, it's a low priority, it's unimportant. And so this question that so many things are related and linked poses particular challenges, and I think there's no area where this is more important and more significant than in the area of peace building. So let me move on to the word peace building. There's a campaign to get it into the Webster's Dictionary. Lots of efforts now on International Day of Peace to have the word recognized. So why? What is it about? First of all, there is a sense that making peace is not really what this is about. Making peace, what's making peace? Negotiating, signing an agreement, sitting around a table, negotiating peace in the same sense, particularly with so many conflicts today being internal conflicts within countries, conflicts about identity, conflicts among ethnic groups, etc. So even though negotiations continue on Syria, lots of negotiations around Burma and the Rohingya issue, South Sudan, they seem to have a new peace agreement every couple of weeks. There are plenty of negotiations. That's not really the issue. And keeping peace seems to imply armed forces, though there's also a very interesting organization called the Nonviolent Peace Force, which aims to sort of put people in harm's way. And one of the case studies in our book on women, religion, and peace is an all-women's observation force in the Philippines that basically is trying to keep peace. Defining peace is a large conflict. What's defining peace? We all know that peace is not just the opposite of fighting, not fighting. It's not really the opposite of war. It's the ideal we have for the human condition. Conflict is not all negative. So how do we think about these challenges? And so one of the ways in which that's happened is the term peace building. Scott Appleby, Lederach use it, but it essentially implies that building peace is a permanent, continuing effort that we will never completely conclude. And so peace building is the broad term for many of the things that we're looking at. So two sort of examples of what the problems are. We had a presentation the other day on Sarvodaya in Sri Lanka, which is an amazing organization, but this is a slide from his presentation that essentially illustrates one of the dramas on peace and conflict, which is that it recurs and recurs and recurs. In other words, you have peace and then you have a conflict breaking out. More than half of conflicts occur again. So you have crisis, conflict, peace, etc. And his comment there was that Sri Lanka is in a post-war, but not a post-conflict situation. They haven't resolved the underlying issues. And this is a photograph from northern Nigeria, an organization called Bits of Borno, but it essentially shows the misery that goes with conflict. And in this case, nobody even knows what the internally displaced population is in Nigeria, but it's in the millions now, people living in the kind of conditions that this woman is living in. Another aspect of this, I'm in many ways by nature a historian, so I'm quite struck in two situations recently where people have told me about the origins of conflict, people from the country. They begin hundreds of years ago. In other words, this is not an immediate proximate if you don't understand the roots of the conflict going back. So in Burundi, which is similar to Rwanda, with the Hutu-Tutsi tensions, the person who told the story went back to 1600 and well before, and to tensions there. Very different understandings and narratives. Narrative is another word that we use a lot, of the way that people understand and see their stories. And it even goes back to how you see creation. In other words, why do people think they're on the earth? All of that comes into this challenge of understanding. And I was in a Tuareg refugee camp in northern Mauritania, where people were again telling the story of why the Tuareg, the desert peoples of the Sahel belt, were facing such tensions and conflict, and they went back to the 1500s. They also brought in Libya, the conflict with Libya, but essentially it was the importance of these historic roots. So the metaphor of the spider web is one that I often find myself returning to, and the links among the different facets of a problem are as intricate as this tangled web. To some extent, you can start with the center and try to see what it is, but when you take the spokes out, they'll go in different dimensions. So you have the issues that we're looking at primarily today: development, conflict, peace, and justice. But there are many other dimensions that include geography, history, politics, environment, demography, personal leadership, etc. So you have a situation of enormously complex causality. Examples of Rwanda, Myanmar, DRC, Guatemala. I'll come back probably to some of those as I move forward. So as much as peace building needs definition, so does development. The clearly underlying people who are interested in development is a notion of progress. But it comes up against sometimes a very romanticized image of a much simpler and happier past. I always return, when people are hostile to globalization or to the notions of development and so forth, to the fact that it wasn't very long ago, including in my own family, when people had 14 children and expecting up to half of them to die before they were 5. When people's life expectancy was in the 40s and 50s, if you were lucky, where disease was something you could do almost nothing about. And where vast numbers, if not a majority of people, were malnourished, had very, very limited opportunity to choose the kind of life that they would lead. So I'm always uneasy about the romanticized images of the past. But we're still in a situation now where the developing versus developed has very little meaning. The World Bank actually has abolished using the word, or is trying to abolish using the word, developing countries, because there really is no such thing. All countries are developing. Maybe there's no such thing as developed countries, but in any event, the term is misleading because it suggests a world divided into two groups, which it is not. Many of you may still use the term third world, but you may have very little idea of what the second world was, because that's something that really disappeared before many of you were born. We still may have a fourth world, which is the way some people refer to the very, very poor. I always cringe when I hear North versus South, because I think that's an artificial distinction. So the point is that these words and these distinctions have lost meaning in our far, far more complex world. I also have dealt in 3 cases with what was termed in the World Bank degraduation. I don't know if you've ever thought about degraduation, but countries in the development business basically are expected to, and often do, progress, so that, for example, countries that used to receive World Bank assistance include Japan, New Zealand, Israel, Greece, etc. But when they reach certain stages of prosperity, and then they are no longer eligible, and they graduate from that kind of assistance. But in Venezuela, Cote d'Ivoire, and actually even for a period South Korea, those countries faced such massive crises that they needed assistance again, and so they had to go through a degraduation process. So you do have situations of countries going up and then going down, hopefully in a positive direction. I have one colleague who left me with a metaphor that I use quite often and find it very apt, which is, he said, strategy is keeping the herd moving generally westward. In other words, you're trying to see a direction that countries and communities and people are moving in, that you don't necessarily even know what the direction is. You're trying to deal with the stragglers, but you're certainly not controlling and guiding each and every one of them, and they will change path. But even so, I think we should remember that there is a leading narrative, and the leading narrative of many specialists is that development prevents conflict. In other words, if people have education, if they have jobs, if they have decent health care, if they have security, it's unlikely that they're going to kill each other, that they're going to be involved in violent conflicts. And it's also totally obvious that conflict destroys development, that when you have wars, you're bombing power stations, you're bombing schools, you're destroying health centers, and all of that is obvious. But the idea has always been that after a conflict, you have post-conflict, DDR, demobilization, etc., and that it's followed in an orderly sequence by a more positive, forward-looking, deeper development sequence. But in reality, it doesn't really work that way. And in most situations, things do and must occur simultaneously with powerful links among them. For a long time, the humanitarian institutions and the humanitarian world operated quite separately from the major development institutions, including sometimes bilateral agencies of governments, but also the multilateral agencies in the UN. So I, for example, in many years at the World Bank, never really worked with the World Food Program, even though I was working on agriculture for many years, because the World Food Program is primarily concerned with humanitarian assistance and relief. But now there is a recognition that the two cannot be separated. And that the humanitarian world and the development world need to work more closely together. So you have an odd situation now in many academic programs, but also in the institutional landscape, where you actually do have peace and conflict programs, development programs, humanitarian refugee studies that don't necessarily link up. And yet, within the real world, there is an increasing recognition that you simply cannot separate them. So just to take again the example from Sri Lanka and Sarvodha, the way that they present it is in these lovely circles where you have essentially the consciousness. In other words, they see the need for really a personal awareness. The economics, if you don't have jobs, if you don't have the money to pay for schools and health centers, for electricity, for all the other things that are needed, you can't get very far. And power, politics, who's making the decisions and how they're going about it, are all involved in peace, empowerment, and sustainable development as an integrated process. Turning to the United Nations, I could ask all of you to recite the Sustainable Development Goals, but I will not. It's a framework that replaced the Millennium Development Goals that were the product of looking at the turn of the millennium in the year 2000. There were 10 Millennium Development Goals. No, sorry, 8. There were 8. But in 2015, after the deadline for achieving those passed, there was an elaborate process that resulted in the Sustainable Development Goals. There's 17 goals and 169 targets and far more indicators of progress. But it is, in many senses, the architecture for the development and the peace-building world. Today. You will see posters of the SDGs in many settings. It is something that really does provide a framework. in order to try to make that comprehensible and more palatable, they've now turned that or defined it in terms of 5 Ps, the 5 Ps of sustainable development, which are prosperity, the point that I just made about having some kind of economic progress. There's disagreement about that, by the way, a lot of disagreement, but it is a very strongly held premise of the economics community that if you do not have economic growth, you do not have the possibility of reaching sustainable development. People is the focus on education and health as the most important area. Planet is the relatively new but sharp focus on the environment and on dealing with climate change as linked to the others. Peace, which is clearly the conflict resolution, and then partnership, which implies that in the current world where you're talking, one of the phrases from the World Bank is from billions to trillions. You're talking about trillions of dollars that are needed to achieve the 17 goals and targets, that it requires private sector, NGOs, religious communities, governments, multilateral institutions, local communities, etc. So essentially, this is the sort of global architecture that we're dealing with. And part of this, I would point out from the peace point of view, is that in addition to the peacekeeping operations of the United Nations, but also of some of the regional operations, you have the Office of Genocide Prevention. You have UNDP, which is the development arm, UNICEF, focus on children, UN Women, which really focuses on the convention that relates to women. Human rights is described in many cases as the UN's religion, and that's not always used in a positive sense. For some people, it means, first of all, that it has a very narrow focus that emerges from Western history and Western culture. People see it as too aligned with Christianity, particularly, and they see the tension between rights and responsibilities. That's a theme that comes up quite often. But even so, within the global architecture that looks at peace and development, human rights is the grounding and the fundamental theme. I think we also need to add to the which are implicit but less clear if you look at that architecture that I just described, justice and governance. I'm very struck, I'm working on a paper now, and it will be a focus of the meeting next week, on the topic of corruption, which in a Gallup poll is the leading topic of conversation in global conversations. And it is also the leading grievance both for populists and extremists. The problem of corruption comes up all the time. And you can act on it. You can do something about it. There are success stories. There are a lot of disappointments, but there are success stories. And the International Anti-Corruption Conference, the IACC, will meet in October in Copenhagen. One of my frustrations is that it has virtually no religious inputs into the global anti-corruption, the Transparency International, and other actors, which is a real question. But it's also important to remember that if you do polls of people, what is important to you? Security is probably the #1 concern. Without security and at least a semblance of rule of law, neither peace nor development can succeed. So in these concerns and these discussions, how do religious voices come in is the area where I focus now. It's also important to remember that the vast majority of the world's population does not have access to the kind of legal support that we take for granted. That the systems of rule of law and possibility of litigation or whatever is something that is is a part of our privilege in living in wealthier societies. Another topic that comes up again and again, this is a crude image, but it is the way that, that a lot of people I work with see the world, that the top 1% controls 46% of the world's wealth and still feels they don't have enough, while the majority of the world's population has far, far less resources. So that my children, when they were little, the first word that they learned to say was no. They were very clear on that. But the second word was, it's not fair. And this sense of fairness is so deeply ingrained, I think. They've done studies with animals and chimpanzees showing that there is an awareness that someone else is getting more and a sense that this may not be just. So in these discussions about peace and conflict, this question of inequality and fairness is very critical. And I would add, finally, culture. And happiness as goals. Swedish public health specialist Hans Rosling, who sadly died a couple of years ago, has wonderful TED Talks and presentations where he urges us to distinguish means and ends. And what he says is, yes, economic growth, political participation, education, etc., are vital means. You need to focus on them. He said, but that's not the end. The end is really having a good environment and culture, because culture is what gives meaning to life and joy, the diversity that comes with it. So I think that this issue of what it is all about is something we should never forget. I'm always intrigued by the fascination with the Bhutan gross national happiness. It's something the king came up with almost spontaneously in a press interview. Somebody asked him about gross national product, and he said, no, what we're after is gross national happiness. And people's eyes mist over when they hear about gross national happiness. It sounds so much more appealing than income and prosperity. In fact, if you look at what they've done in Bhutan, and there's a whole community of people who work on GNH, is they actually look at very similar issues. They look at the environment, they look at education, they look at opportunity, they look at equality and participation, but they frame it as a gross national happiness as opposed to income, which we know is not really what it's about, we hope. So religion, where does religion come into it? The religious issue is fascinating. But for me, the sort of first image is I've been on several panels recently where you have one person who will argue vehemently about a conflict in Nigeria, in Myanmar, Central African Republic, Darfur, you name it, any one of the horrible conflicts, Syria, that are going on in the world, and they will say this has nothing to do with religion. And yet you'll do Pew surveys, or you will talk to people involved, and they will say this is primarily about religious identity. So you have these very contradictory narratives about what religion has to do with it. There are surveys and measures that show that religion comes into it in many cases. But you also have surveys that say that religion is really a smokescreen for economic factors, conflicts between herders and farmers, which you know in this part of the world have been there from as long as we can remember. It seems that especially violent features of conflicts are sometimes linked to religious ties and identities. Questioning a creation narrative, the power of symbols. Cattle in India is something that holy sites seem to generate a passion that you don't see in other kinds of conflicts. But still, the bottom line is context matters, and it's very complicated. So looking at Nigeria, this is a phrase from a report that I saw last week, a toxic mix of impunity and organized crime has transformed a low-level conflict between nomadic pastoral communities and farmers into Nigeria's deadliest violence. It's much more deadly right now than Boko Haram. And there are widespread incidents of crime that include cattle theft, arson, arms trafficking. And you see, religion is not even here, and yet it's an underlying issue because the nomads tend to be Muslim and the settlers tend to be Christian. So it takes on a whole different flavor. There's a lot of exploration now in scholarship and practice about religious peace building. People are looking for distinctive approaches, Catholic peace building, Muslim, Buddhist, etc. And there do seem to be some areas, we were talking at lunch about forgiveness, trauma healing, the issues of memory that I was referring to in the beginning, people tracing a conflict back hundreds and hundreds of years. Interfaith is something that gets a lot of attention, both as a symbol, in other words, a Muslim imam, a rabbi, a priest, standing together, symbolizing that the communities have so much in common. But most people, I think, would favor, and I certainly would, that interfaith that deals with practical issues, whether it's protecting threatened religious sites or finding a common interest in housing or food and working together is the most effective. Some examples, the community of Sant'Egidio does absolutely remarkable work in building peace. Very unusual story. Religions for Peace is doing everything they can in Myanmar. There's an organization called Kaisid, which is the King Abdullah's Saudi, Austrian, and Spanish. Pope Francis visited Lampedusa. He's been in Myanmar, Bangladesh, Central African Republic. Buddhist leaders are working for peace in Thailand. So there are countless stories of creative efforts to bring religious leaders in. When you're dealing with religion, though, there are two big problems. As somebody puts it, you tend to have older men with hats, with big hats. And any picture, there are websites that track all male religious leader gatherings because they leave out the women and they leave out the young people. And they may not be ordained, they may not have formal roles, but they are absolutely critical. So the question, and women's issues are chronically neglected in peace agreements. So I am coming to the end of my time, so let me just list some of the areas where as I was reflecting, came upon some lessons. I worked on Rwanda extensively in the 70s. So what did we miss? We were working on development. The genocide came afterwards, 70s and 80s. We knew about the Hutu-Tutsi tensions. We knew about the demography and pressures on land. But there were too many subjects that were untouchable with the government, and we backed off as an institution. In Burundi, we knew also about the problems with inclusion, but we backed off again. In fact, we negotiated agreements, but then we didn't apply them as an institution. Zaire, Democratic Republic of the Congo, we were caught in the contradictions between a country where you could do things with enormous potential, but you had Mobutu, a hideously corrupt leader, and power politics, the influence of the United States and other countries insisting on Zaire as an ally. Mozambique, Madagascar, we didn't appreciate the deep scars of history. Mozambique, we paid too little attention to women's roles, and that's had major consequences. In Kenya, the cancer of corruption has undermined almost every positive aspect of that remarkable country. The Gambia, we came very close to an understanding with the government, but it was too late, and there was a coup which derailed development for 30 years. East Asia, we were blinded by the surface success of development and failed to see the absence of social safety nets that were needed as society changed. So maybe I'll just stop there and go on to a few of very quick reflections on the G20 Interfaith Forum. which you all are running, basically out of BYU Law School. Enormous efforts are going into a very ambitious meeting. We see the legitimacy of this forum as a network of networks, drawing in many parties and focusing sharply, which the formal agenda of the G20 does not, on the marginalized, those at the end of the road. And the challenge is to bring religious voices into these global discussions. That's what this is about. So I'll be focusing particularly on the tensions around countering violent extremism, corruption on the agenda, and overall religious freedom is a linking theme as part of a framework of human rights. So a few last sort of challenges and questions. I think we're all of us trying to deal with this challenge of inequality and fairness, because that underlies so many of the tensions. And it's complicated. I talked about panels where people say contradictory things and don't notice it. You can also hear panels of distinguished economists where one says the world is getting more unequal and the other says it's getting less unequal. The problem is that it is both, and it is complicated. It depends on how you frame it and how you look at it. There are nowhere near enough resources for the key activities in peace building that we need. There's bizarre competitiveness in the conflict resolution field. A lot of different actors scrambling for resources, scrambling for reputation and for access. And the same is true with religious engagement and religious freedom. I think we need to focus a lot more on government roles in these processes. My donkey metaphor highlights the importance of blind spots, of what people don't see, and the silos of disciplines and approaches that I referred to. So looking ahead, I have 5 critical messages. First, peace, justice, human dignity, and opportunity have to be integrated. We have to look at them as part of a whole. We have to wrestle with the spectrum from personal peace, consciousness in the Sarvodya example, to the problems at a global level, which include globalization, arms trade, all of the other issues that you can only tackle at a global level. Religious dimensions must be part of this mix, and they are not always. It is a challenge and something that is anathema to some people. They simply do not want to engage. Some aspects of this religious role are sort of banal, but some of them are very complex, and they require a careful and professional approach. The issue of women is their involvement in all these issues is vital. I would remind you that for the development profession, perhaps the 2 single most important factors in success and development are education and a changing role of women in society. Those are the 2 most important. And clearly there are a lot of religious institutions that have hesitations on the full implications of equality. And finally, these are all ethical issues. Every single development issue involves ethics. And seeing them through an ethics lens is absolutely critical. So concluding thoughts, blessed are the peacemakers. A Hans Küng phrase is that there's no peace without peace among religions, and there's no peace among religions without dialogue among religions. So that's a sort of another almost truism. Transitional justice is clearly a critical issue, particularly for people in law schools. We're building, not making or keeping peace. We need to manage conflict, not eliminate it, because we'll never eliminate conflict. And competition. Inner peace is not unimportant, and it is related to these issues. We focus at our university, I'm based in a university, on knowledge and case studies as a way forward. I come back again to women and end with a comment from Eleanor Roosevelt. It isn't enough to talk about peace, one must believe in it. And it isn't enough to believe in it, one must work at it. So thank you, and I guess we have time for questions.
So there are microphones.
I'm Gabby Savalonis. I'm a law student here at BYU. I was just wondering if you could articulate more about, you mentioned a couple of times that women were important in a full integrated peace building process. Could you elaborate a little bit more about why?
Okay. Well, to start with the situation, there are various surveys and definitions, but in general, the sort of most dramatic example of the problem is that of all the peace treaties and agreements that are around, only 2% have a woman's name involved in them. And because in many cases, the people who come to the negotiating table are the ones who have arms, it's very rare to see women at peace negotiations. Now, of course, peace negotiations are not the whole story. But you have a systematic, deep-seated neglect of women. And what that means is that a lot of women's perspectives and understandings, their assets and their concerns are not represented in the post-conflict work and in the work of peace building, if we define it broadly. So why is that important? Obviously, well, first, one reason is that women are primarily, for better or for worse, responsible for children. And primarily responsible for the care of children. So children's issues are neglected if you neglect the women. There's a very complex debate as to whether women bring different assets. So I don't know where we would be if we did a poll in this room. Are women in some generic sense different? Do they bring different approaches to negotiations or to thinking about peace? There are some people who would vehemently argue that is essentializing women, that women are, each one is different, and that these generalizations are false. But we did a lot of work with women, religion, and peace, and we had meetings. It was fascinating. We had meeting after meeting with groups of women, and they would go through, well, women tend to be better at reaching out to other communities, are better listeners, they are more interested in the strength of the community, etc. And then they would back off and say, no, but you can't essentialize women. So as I say, it's a running debate. But I'll tell you what my view is. My view is that there is and this is, I'm old, so sort of experience over many years, I think there really is a very big difference in both tone and approach and in agendas when you have a mix of men and women, or if you have women as a separate group, than if you have all men. So the agendas issue in some ways is the more important. And you know, we do surveys of communities, and what do you want? What's most important to you? And very often, if you are focusing on the men in a community, they may say transport. They may say jobs in the city. If you ask the women, they're more likely to say schools and health. And you know, we'd love to have a complementary view where you take both of those into account. Now, in the peace field, because you've had this very heavy emphasis on men as part of the formal diplomatic peace processes, there are fairly active efforts to engage women. What we did in our book and in our study, I was working with the U.S. Institute of Peace, was essentially to look for, within each religious tradition, to the way in which the religious traditions were looking at women. Because it's, when you come to religion, it's even worse than it is in the secular world, because there are so many religious traditions that don't have women in leadership positions. But we were looking for traditions, how the traditions approach it, and the reinterpretation of sacred texts by women that's taking place in many traditions now, Muslim, Jewish, Christian, Buddhist, etc. But we also were looking for examples of remarkable women working for peace. Colombia has a lot of very interesting examples. I think the Philippines actually has the largest number of women who are directly involved all the way from the president's office down to the community. So there is a sense that it needs a very big push. And it is related to what I said before, that it's almost axiomatic that changing roles of women is critical to success and development. Whether people apply that is another issue. We often have a gap between what people say and what they actually do and the way that it's translated, but it certainly is a premise. And interestingly, when you look back, what really changed the picture was the research that demonstrated the extraordinary benefits of educating girls. And that persuaded even people like Larry Summers, who was the Secretary of the Treasury and who was at the World Bank. He found the rigorous research about the benefits of girls' education so persuasive that he made the case in many situations that it was the single most important investment you could make, educating girls. And there's some dramatic examples. I know that with every year, particularly, interestingly, it really is even more dramatic for secondary education than for primary. But there's a correlation between the number of years of a girl's education and her children's head size, which is related to understanding of nutrition. I mean, that may not be the most important thing, but it certainly sort of captures the attention. That this is an issue that has implications that go far beyond the simple ability to read and write and help your children with your homework and so forth. So, does that answer your question? I wasn't sure whether you were skeptical or interested.
I think we have time for one more question, and then students, Professor Marshall has agreed to meet with a group of students at 2 o'clock afterwards, so that'll be a little informal. I think there's some light refreshments, and you get a chance to ask more questions and hear, if you're interested, she's going to share about her career path and things like that. So you're certainly welcome to stay and be a part of that if you're available.
My name is Alex Bollinger, and I'm an international relations student. And I was wondering if you could describe how you did or would deal with corruption in the countries you were working in.
How you deal with corruption?
Yes.
Well, first of all, I had to deal when I was in the World Bank as an officer with accusations of corruption in specific countries, in specific situations, and to shape both our response in a negative sense. In other words, did we stop a project because we had evidence of corruption, and in a positive sense, because there is a recognition that dealing with corruption, you need to frame it within a strategic approach. You need to have a diagnosis of what's more important than other areas. I had to deal with Indonesia in the midst of the East Asia crisis. And I'll linger on that for a second because I think it was a fascinating crisis and very, very telling. There was a Wall Street Journal article that basically had 4 levels of accusation about the World Bank's role in Indonesia. So the first one was that some World Bank staff were actually corrupt. I mean, you can think of that, your professors are taking money. I mean, that's, it's very personal and very specific. And by the way, nothing was ever proved. And that was, I think, more perception than reality. The second was that there was extensive corruption within the procurement mechanisms for given projects. And that the World Bank was either thick and blind, or was deliberately colluding, basically, to allow the corruption in procurement, buying textbooks, building schools, etc., to proceed. The third was more complicated. At that time, and still, a lot of development assistance goes in the form of very large, what are called policy-based loans. In other words, you will disperse $200 million, even up to several billion dollars, to a government to support a broad program. And that's, in a sense, considered the best practice in countries that are more sophisticated. And what the accusation in the Wall Street Journal at that time, during the East Asia crisis, was that the World Bank, by supporting these kinds of loans to the Suharto government, was deceptive vis-a-vis the private sector, as well as to the Indonesian people, in not pointing out the broad flaws within the system. And the fourth level of accusation was that an organization that doesn't take corruption seriously, how can you trust their data? In other words, the numbers on poverty and on everything else. So it was, what was happening was linking many different aspects. And what happened there was I was asked to lead a group, a team of experts, world experts, to try to come up with some kinds of ideas on how to move forward. The problem then was that there was political turmoil and there was an election approaching, and our recommendation was this is not the time for a broad-based approach. It simply won't work. And that was what actually happened. And since then, there have been a whole series of governance reforms that focus on the judiciary, focus on the audit mechanisms, et cetera, that I understand have led to substantial improvements. So what we're doing now, and I can't point to any successes, I'm still working on it, is this mysterious reality that very few religious organizations are involved in the anti-corruption networks. And I was at the Cumbre de las Americas in Peru in April with a group of religious leaders before the heads of state met, where corruption in Latin America is the issue right now. And the question was they really had very few tools. The only central point they make is that you have to change values, that changing values is what's important, and therefore through sermons and through education you have to change values. But we don't have time for that. There's too much happening. And so I think that we need, all of us, scholars, lawyers, everyone needs to find better ways to bring these communities closer together. So.
Okay, thank you very much.
Well, thank you. And thank you for the lovely bonsai.